not going to be focused specifically on fire impacts to vineyards. I'm going to be talking a little bit more generally, and then hopefully we'll get into some of those things in the panel. We've got some notes here just to make sure I capture everything. Forgive me, I'm going to go relatively quickly. I have a lot of material that I want to get through, but luckily this is a pretty savvy audience. So let's just do a little bit of context. I know most of you know that we live in a Mediterranean climate region, but I'm going to cover it just for a second. Most of California, southwestern Oregon, and northwestern Mexico belong to the North American Mediterranean climate region. I will refer to the Mediterranean climate regions as MCRs in the rest of my presentation. Worldwide, the Mediterranean climate regions are characterized by their locations on the west coasts between 30 and 45 degrees. There's a cold ocean current offshore, and they have warm, dry summers and cool, wet winters. Believe it or not, that's a really rare combination of factors on the planet. Since we live there, we figure that's the way it is everywhere, but it's not. The MCRs constitute only about 2% of the world's land area, but 7% of the world's population lives there. And they support some of the world's biggest economies, while also being the most biodiversity part of the world's land area outside of the Western Hemisphere tropics. That's another thing that people actually don't know. Ventura County in California is the most biodiverse county in the entire United States, for example. Because of the great weather and the high biological productivity, the MCRs are also heavily populated, and they have also suffered very high levels of ecological degradation. Okay. So Dan talked at length about climate change in California, so I'm going to skip mostly over this. But there are a lot of really significant ecological threats in all of the MCRs in the world. Because they are situated just poleward of the world's most arid regions, the deserts, they're also subject to desertification, which is a really major problem in many of the MCRs. We don't talk about it much in California, but we should be talking about it. In the other MCRs, drying trends are very strong, but like Dan showed you, precipitation in California has remained steady, and the model suggests it may even increase, although it'll come more as rain than as snow, probably, in the future. The big story at this point is, and I think you had exactly the same graphic on the left in your presentation, Dan, but the big story in California right now is the pronounced trend in atmospheric warming, especially at night. That's the atmospheric warming, and the right hand is the trend at night, and its impacts on water availability and on wildfire. In all of the MCRs, there's a worrying trend of larger wildfires and increasingly destructive burning at the same time, with growing impacts to humans, their infrastructures, and their economies as well. But the thing that you have to remember is that, there we go, that fire is a natural process in all of the MCRs, except actually for Chile. And I'm not going to talk about why that is. You can ask me for a trivia question afterwards, and I can explain for you why that is. The MCRs are actually the most fire-prone bioregion in the world outside of the subtropical savannas. Okay? California, for example, is nice and cool and relatively rainy in the winter. It grows a lot of biomass. We have the world's biggest trees in California, and then it dries out for 5 or 6 months every summer. It's a perfect situation to be burning things all of the time. And as a result, a lot of species, a lot of ecosystems, and a lot of ecosystem processes are actually dependent on fire, all right, in a place like California. So fire regimes are statistical descriptions of the way that fire tends to work under certain physiographic, biologic, and climatic conditions. For example, how often do fires tend to burn? Where do they tend to burn? How intense do they tend to be? How patchy are they, for example? And in California, for more than 10,000 years, humans have played a major role in altering fire regimes, starting with Native Americans, who used frequent low-impact burning as their major landscape management tool, and continuing to Euro-Americans, who had an inordinate fear of fire and have sought largely to erase it from the landscape. Since the settlement of California by Euro-Americans, there have been rapid and pervasive changes to fire regimes all across the state. On the left-hand side, for example, that's a chaparral landscape. In these kinds of places, or generally in urban and peri-urban areas, also in the Great Basin, and in some cases in the desert, you've had major invasion by flammable invasive species introduced by humans and or high human ignition densities. And these have led to increased fire frequencies, especially under weather conditions that favor really rapid fire spread. You guys have had a few of those in the last few years, and you will have more of them in the future. So we need to be prepared for that stuff. But in other places, and this is the condition on the right, human agency has actually reduced fire frequency on the landscape. And this is very, very common in large areas of forest, of fire-prone and seasonally dry forest in the western United States, right? Where the long-term, what are examples? Ponderosa pine forest, a mixed conifer forest, Jeffrey pine forest, oak woodlands are another great example of systems that are really dependent on fire for their structure. But in these systems, the long-term absence of fire has led to forest densification, a successful regeneration of species that are normally knocked out by fire and are not very tolerant to fire, and accumulations of fuel. And when fires escape initial attack in these kinds of landscapes today, we generally get very large and very destructive wildfires. So we can actually map fire regime departures in California. This is only dealing with the fire frequency part of that equation. But what this is some work that we did relatively recently where we basically compared modern fire frequencies over the last century in California to their inferred frequencies obtained from paleoecological data sources. And you can see that this map of California splits most of the state into pretty much two groups. The cool colors represent areas that are burning much less often now than they did before 1850. And the warm colors are areas that we think are burning a little bit or a lot more frequently than they did before 1850. Now, there's a caveat here, and that is that we don't have maps of vegetation for California in 1850, okay? So we have to base this on inferences we make and modern vegetation maps with a little bit of, jury rigging. But I want to note that the yellow section, which is largely the chaparral belt, a lot of that is only in yellow and yellow-green, and that's not really what I would call significant departure. So I just want to note that what we're talking about are systems in which it's difficult to maintain things like chaparral on the landscape anymore, because believe it or not, you can burn chaparral too often, and it disappears on landscapes, and I'm going to talk about that more here in just a second. But I want to note, too, that the Bay Area is blank on this map because we did this map for federal lands, National Park Service, Forest Service managed lands. There are not many of them in the North Bay Area. And the North Bay Area, obviously, is a pretty complex landscape. You've got conifer forests, you have hardwood forests, you have woodlands, right? You have chaparral, there's a lot of grassland in the system, there's a lot of cultural and urban landscape as well. In some of the MCRs, human populations in the last 3 or 4 years have expanded massively into fire-prone landscapes, and I think California is kind of the poster child for this. Today, 11 million Californians, that's more than a quarter of the entire population, live in the wild and urban interface. And although fire is increasingly erratic, and although it is increasingly severe due to climate change effects and in fire-prone forests, fuel accumulation as well, the major factor behind human losses really is increased exposure to fire risk. It really isn't yet being driven, I don't think, all that much by these other factors. And Sonoma and Napa County are the poster children for this. Okay, and I know you guys have seen these graphics, but this is from a John Keeley and Alex Safford paper where they simply note that, as an example of this pattern, you can take the Hanley fire from 1964, you can take the Tubbs fire from 2017. They burned in the same area, they were about the same size, similar times of year, they were both driven by wind, and the Tubbs fire killed 20 times more people and burned down 25 or 30 times more homes. Okay, that's simply due to an increase in the exposure of humans to fire. It's a little bit like that story we tell about mountain lions and bears. It's the humans creating the issue. It's not the mountain lions and bears. They were always there. You know what I mean? You can't forget that. So the next 4 slides I'm going to show, you'll all know these landscapes, are just 2 time series of Google Earth images from 2 locations just northeast of town here, showing the huge increase in suburban and dispersed housing over the last few decades. This is the Mark West Creek area. That's a photo from 2005, and there it is in 2023. Now, you'll know this, and I know this. This landscape burned in the Tubbs fire, so it's a little easier to see homes in this later photo than it was in the first. But housing went up by nearly 200% in this landscape between those 2 photos, okay? And then this one, here's an even better one. That's Fountain Grove in 1994. That's what it looks like today. That's after the Tubbs fire, right? There was an astronomical increase in high-risk human housing, extremely exposed to fire danger in this landscape in the time between, and essentially 0 time was spent thinking about the risk that these people were being put into. 0, all right? just as an aside, and again, I know you guys know this, but Fountain Grove had 1,600 homes burned down in the Tubbs fire.
Lost their homes up there.
Okay, so let's talk about fire hazard and risk. And again, probably a lot of you know a lot about this stuff. So in general, by definition, hazard is the potential for a damaging phenomenon to occur, while risk is the hazard times the potential consequences. So what I've shown is just a really simple formula for risk. There are plenty of others, but they're all basically the same thing. And hazard can be split into two components: the probability of the event times and its intensity. And then consequences can be split into exposure and vulnerability. So I'm going to explain them using COVID-19 and fire, okay? So if we're talking about COVID-19, the hazard in that case would be the presence of the COVID virus tempered by the virulence of the variant in question, okay? Okay, so that's the hazard part. On the fire side, we're talking about just simply the probability of a fire occurring times its intensity, okay? Make sense? So then on the exposure side, you're talking about how exposed people are to an agent. So for COVID, are you living in an overcrowded, I don't know, poorly ventilated, dense apartment with your family and your grandmother and your children and everybody else is in the same place? Are you hanging out in groups of people who don't use masks, right? Are you spending time with lots of people who aren't using masks, things like that? Are you highly exposed, okay? And in the case of let's see here. We're talking about exposure. Yeah, fire is just, are you exposed, right? Are you in an area where there's a chance of a high severity fire or high intensity fire burning on your landscape? In the COVID case with respect to vulnerability, this measures your tendency to be adversely affected once you've contracted the virus, right? So for example, are you old, sick, or otherwise feeble? Are you living close to family or friends who can take care of you? Are you within driving distance of a hospital? Are you well informed as to the most recent and best advice about how to cope with infection? And obviously it translates directly into fire as well. So are your home and property prepared? Do you have an emergency kit ready? Do you know how and when to evacuate? All that kind of stuff. So these are important considerations because wildfire hazard and risk are both growing really rapidly in the U.S., in the western U.S., due to all the factors that I just talked about: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And these last two pictures are, on the left is the increasing footprint of fire, and then on the right, which should have overlaid it, is a good example of actually kind of a important direct climate warming impact on fire, and that's the expansion of the fire season, right? Which in California really used to be from sort of May-ish to September. Now it's March to October here, and in Southern California, it's January to January. And just doesn't really ever stop, right? You have a fire nearly every, well, you do have a fire in every month in Southern California. Okay, well, as a result, they went through that slide a lot more quickly. All right, so there are a whole lot of human values at risk in the system, right? Human deaths are going up, structural losses are going up, economic losses are going up. On the right-hand side are the insured losses, and these were the first cut insured losses. I mean, this is missing most of the economic impact, right? I mean, most towns that burn down in California, I mean, a huge proportion of the people don't even have fire insurance anymore. So how do you know what they lost? There's really no way to know. And there are all of these secondary and tertiary impacts that have been estimated. I mean, the 2020 fires, I think was the one. You know, what do I have on there? 10 billion in insured loss. Oh, there was a paper that came out suggested the losses were closer to 100 billion, right? When you considered everything that was lost, actually. And then here is, this is an estimate of insured fire loss in the 10 worst wildfires in U.S. history up to 2021. So the thing here is, I mean, I think the Lahaina fire in Maui probably is on this list now. I don't think they've finished figuring out what all the insured loss was in the Lahaina fire, but it would be in this list. But you'll note that 3 of the top 6 of these fires were in your backyard. I mean, you guys are on the front lines in all of this stuff, right? And another thing I want to note is that the deaths on this slide, those are direct deaths due to fire impacts, people burning up, or in the case of the Woolsey fire, it was that directly after the fire, the big debris flow thing that wiped out a part of Montecitos. We know now from epidemiological work and studies that probably in a bad fire year, probably 3,000 to 5,000 excess deaths occur directly due to smoke in the state, okay? those don't ever get counted. It's a little bit like COVID, right? I know the government says, oh, 1 million people have died. No, it's about 3 million probably. That's probably the best estimate. But the other 2 million, they were already sick. They had respiratory failure, and they just died. It was like, their lungs were bad. They died. COVID, COVID killed them, and in this case, smoke is killing a lot of people on the landscape. Natural values are also at risk. And so I'm going to just list some of them, but I'm not really going to talk about most of these things. So to me, some of the most worrisome things that impact a lot of us are things like losses in biological diversity, conversion of native vegetation, invasion by exotic species that promote frequent burning, for example. Post-fire earth movements that change landscapes and put people at risk and stuff like that. But the list goes on and on and on. Okay, so here's some examples of vegetation type conversion, one of the factors I just talked about, that are really widespread in the North Coast ranges. And I always get asked this question. The picture on the left is a really classic landscape scene in a recently unburned landscape in Northern California. And that is these weird, like, oak woodland patches surrounded by jungles of chaparral. What is that? That is a remnant of very frequent Native American burning that maintained open savanna-like landscapes because oak was a super important species to them. Food sources, plant and animal habitat, you name it, all right? That burning ceased a long time ago. That landscape has basically been invaded by chaparral. It is now a chaparral landscape, and you've crossed a big threshold in fire behavior now. This landscape burns now, you lose all those oaks, okay? Anyway, and then on the right side is another, I don't know if you guys will recognize that, but that's the lower part of Poudre Creek Canyon, just kind of below the dam, that's a different pattern where chaparral itself is what's being lost in this landscape because of really, really high frequency burning, leaving a degraded grassland type that's dominated by all these Eurasian invaders, basically, right? And it's even reducing the density of oaks. But look how often that site has burned since 2007. It seems to burn about every 2 years now. And then if you look at the future, it's really, really smoky. I mean, I don't need to show this, but any model that's out there all says the same thing. We're basically in for a really, really wild ride over the next 50 years as the climate continues to warm and people continue to build in risky places. And then you have to understand that there are a lot of other interacting stressors and disturbances as well that really magnify the problem. For example, sudden oak death, gold-spotted oak borer, which is coming to NorCal at some point. We were just talking about Mediterranean oak borer, right, just a second ago. Pine beetles, they kill trees, and as a result, they increase fuel loading and they increase fire severity. Invasive grasses increase fire frequency, and drought and atmospheric pollution are major magnifiers of all of these factors. So, we went to the next one. So in the face of these sort of mounting waves of doom and despair, how do we reduce wildfire risk at a speed and scale that's commensurate with the problem? And so to this point, the major focus has really been on reacting to fire after it occurs in sort of heroic battles against nature. The problem is that response is not working all that well on a lot of the landscape anymore. And in a lot of places, it's actually exacerbating the long-term threat of really severe fires, because every fire you put out in a fire-prone ecosystem in a place like California, well, the question is not if it will burn, but when and under what conditions. You're increasing fuels every time you put out a fire. And when you do it for 150 years, you're talking about a 150-year event happening when you finally lose a fire in that system, right? So there have been a lot of calls made for reforming the way that we deal with wildfire and its risks. And one of the most comprehensive was this UN report from 2022, which recommended a major rebalancing of the effort and funding from reacting to fire to proactive risk prevention and risk reduction, and also more funding and effort spent in restoring economies and ecosystems after burning. Now, I provided the full citation for this report here because I think it's probably the best treatment of this thus far out there, but also, full disclosure, I was one of the authors as well. So we need to focus on all the components of risk at one time. And so I'm going to skip pretty quickly through a couple of boring text-filled slides. So let's start about, if we attack the components of risk, it's pretty easy to think about, right? Let's talk about exposure and vulnerability first. How can we reduce exposure? Fire education and prevention. Fire-conscious community zoning and planning. I put a star by that because it's really important. And developers fight it to the death. You just go on Google Earth if you want to see some really scary neighborhoods in California. SoCal in particular, single ways in, towns built in canyons with 8-foot chaparral all around them. It's a death zone is basically what it is. We can reduce, and there's a bunch of other things too. I've just put some other stuff up there too. You can reduce vulnerability by educating ourselves about how better to deal with emergencies, knowing when to stay and when to flee. By guaranteeing that transportation systems, for example, allow people to safely and orderly evacuate in a safe and orderly fashion, and also at the same time are big enough to allow firefighting resources to move potentially in the other direction. This was the big deal in the campfire, right, in Paradise. One of the big deals is they'd considered expanding that highway forever, and the city was like, nah, we didn't really want to do that. Well, yeah, you do. A lot of people died in their cars, you know. Hardening structures is really, really important, right, as is treating fuels on your own property, and by solving the insurance debacle as well. Whoa, I don't know how many of you have had trouble keeping fire insurance, but it is an absolute disaster in California right now. I saw you. And then, let's see here. Yeah, reducing probability of fire. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I talked about it. This has been where we've put most of our eggs for a really, really long time, using technology to try to stop fire after they happen. That's way too late. It's way too late with where the climate is going and with all the people on the landscape. We need to deal with the problem before it becomes a problem, all right? So I think that's all I'm going to say about that one. And then you can reduce the intensity of fire, and I'm going to finish. I'm going to go a couple minutes over, just sorry about that. I've been following my time. I think I'm actually pretty good. This is really, really important, and this is what I'm talking about. Make sure I'm covering all my stuff here, is reducing fire intensity, right? So this is usually accomplished through proactive fuel reduction. You can do it a bunch of ways. You can use machines, you can use your hand, you can use fire, for example, and I know there's going to be a panel right afterwards to talk a little bit about how fire can be used in this work. And the most effective methods probably combine all these things, right? Because you can be strategic about where you remove wood, what you do with the wood, but in the end, you have to reduce fine fuels on the landscape because that's what drives most fire behavior, and fine fuels get reduced by prescribed fire. That is the thing that does a great job. It's a vacuum for fine fuels. So it is always going to be part of the conversation. Mechanical fuel management is less risky. It's a little bit less random in its effects, but it actually tends to increase fine fuels on the landscape. So it can be a component of what you do, but you've got to deal with the fine fuel problem. The problem is that California, in a very short-sighted way, as the rest of the U.S. is similar, has lost most of its sawmills. It doesn't really have much in the way of a bioenergy infrastructure anymore. There are no alternative wood sources out there. We basically don't have any really true full-service mills in California like they have in the Southeast. Those are really, really big issues, and the state's trying to solve them. So this is my last section, I promise. So I'll note that in my presentation I talked about, what was it, fuel reduction, where, why, and how, where, how, and why, something like that. This is the where. You can't do proactive fuel reduction everywhere because there's never going to be sufficient money to do all the work that has to be done, so you need to be strategic, all right? And planning to do this stuff used to be, and still kind of is, really time intensive. Like think about, have you ever been involved in a federal agency planning effort for anything? Whoa! 5 years, 10 years, millions of dollars, multiple lawsuits, all done on paper. Well, that's changing because these days, you know, you've got artificial intelligence, you've got advances in programming, advances in computing speed, and a bunch of other stuff, right? New planning regulations. So these are just 3 examples of optimization software platforms that are out there that can do a lot of really cool stuff. Forces is is an optimization program, and you can find info on all these things online, that the Forest Service used, for example, to plan its 10-year wildfire crisis strategy right now, which is using a lot of Biden administration money. Land Tender is the tool from the business that I work with now that combines Forces with a bunch of other models like fire models and management models and forest growth models. It can calculate economic inputs and outputs. It can give you assess impacts to human assets, recreation, biodiversity, carbon, you know, all that kind of stuff. And then Plantscape is supposed to be sort of a free baby version of Land Tender, and it's in development. California Natural Resources Agency and Google had a collaboration on this, but then Google dropped out. It's fallen behind schedule, and they say that it might be out the end of this year. Okay, and then just some examples. You can get these really cool maps with return on investment based on your choices as to what you care the most about. On the left, you can toggle those things back and forth. There's a lot of complex, under the hood stuff going on under here, but anyone can manipulate this thing and understand real quickly where you get the biggest bang for your buck. And then you can get all these different outputs that give you comparisons of different scenarios and tell you what the ecosystem impacts are, the economic inputs, what are you going to get out of in sawmill timber and in biomass, and where could it go, and blah, blah, blah. So I'm just going to segue now into the panel, okay? Then I'm done. So let me find my slide. This is my notes here. Okay, I just want to underline the extreme importance of fire to the history and to the ecology of California. The control of fire was the most fundamental step in human technology, right? You get that. That was the step. Step one. Humans learned how to control fire. That was the very first technological advance, really, in human society. And think about it. Native Americans depended on fire for their sustenance and for their protection, but Euro-Americans, who'd mostly been trained in forestry in Germany and France, where fires never occurred, saw it as an aberration and have since tried to stop it. So now we're paying the price of that short-sightedness. So in the early 70s, some of you might remember, a lot of you folks were around in those days, you might remember the Forest Service and the Park Service embarking on this like ecological use of fire thing, where all of a sudden they were using wildfires and they were, but over the subsequent 50 years, they conveniently kind of forgot all of it. And right now, the split between fire management and resource management in the federal agencies is the widest I've ever seen it. It's incredibly, there's a gap, a giant gap between those two sides of the agency. But we're starting to see a resurgence of interest in fire as a management tool, and I think it's really cool. Forest Service and the Park Service allow some parts of wildfires to be managed for their ecological outcomes. The state and the U.S. Forest Service have an MOU to greatly increase the role of prescribed fire in their fuel reduction activities. There are a lot of California state plans and strategies that recognize the need to incorporate fire as a friend rather than as a foe. And then finally, a lot of recent California laws and regulations are making it a lot easier for people like you and me, tribal members, citizens, rural landowners, et cetera, to get trained and certified in prescribed fire use and to do their own burning on their own landscapes, very often with the help of agencies like CAL FIRE, for example. And I really, really look forward to the panel that's coming afterwards. Okay, anyway, this is I run the California Prescribed Fire Monitoring Program, and my team at UC Davis was working with Forest Service on a program. Sorry I went a little bit over, but I'm done. Thanks a lot.